both consciously and non-consciously, that configures our thought and imaginings and dreams and everything else, how that organisation may look to pre-adaptations in our perceptions. So the organisation of concepts perhaps maps from the organisation of percepts. And I think there's a kind of play of metaphor going on within that mapping as well, actually. So I think some of that, the logic of how percepts work in the world, would be drawn either from the accessible physics of that world, or they would be drawn from the logic of our perceptual apparatus itself. I'm not sure if I've got time to rethink this out right now, but I guess the logic of percepts, which draws from the physics of the world, is a kind of thing like if I drop something, I hold an apple in my hand and drop it, there's a kind of accessible physics which determines how that percept will work. It starts at a certain elevation, moves through an area of space, and then ends in another location. And that's accessible through my perception, but it's kind of outside of it. It's a schematic. It's one that keeps happening over and over again. And it seems to me that that's a logic which you can also use to order concepts, abstract concepts that aren't visible, aren't out there in the world. And indeed, I think that's where metaphor comes in, conceptual metaphor. I don't know if there is an identified schema associated with the dropping of an object. Probably is. But certainly there are lots of metaphors to do with falling, to do with elevation, things like the economy, for example, which falls. I think we can see that relationship between the starting location, if you like, of the economy and the ending location of the economy, and its process through conceptual space, in the same way that we would imagine the descent of an apple and the influence of gravity. So we're taking the organisational logic of percept and mapping it onto the organisational logic of concepts, and that organisational logic comes from the kind of physics that our bodies seem to be engaged with. I say seem to be because obviously lots of physics that seems to be real that our bodies don't engage with, things like quantum physics and certain aspects of astrophysics, for example. Big bark fences. Come on, you two. Come on. But in addition to that, that logical mapping, there's probably also the third thing going on, which alludes more closely to this lecture I just mentioned, which is to do with the logic of perception, the logic of the perceptual apparatus itself, rather than the logic of the world outside. And obviously, this will be a relationship. So, for example, the fact that I can look across this field, close my eyes, turn my head, open my eyes again, and see a completely different sight without any intervening period of transformation. The trees and the birds and the clouds haven't sort of magically morphed into a flyover, a bridge. But there it is, and there those two things are. So there's another kind of logic, I think, underpinning certain conceptual transformations, or certain conceptual grammatical operations, if you like, which perhaps draws from that kind of logic. And I guess I'm thinking there about things like, what happens when you suddenly change your stream of thought, or when you're having a dream, you suddenly jump from one episode to the next, or one sight experiential thought to the next. I'm not quite sure of that one, but there seems to be some kind of logic there. Okay, so I guess just what I'm kicking around here, and I'm talking far more than I intended to today, I guess what I'm saying there is that there may be a kind of organisational, the organisation of concepts may draw on two other kinds of organisation, or two emphases in organisation of the physical world. One which is kind of out there in the physics of that world, to do with gravity, to do with momentum, to do with object extension in space, those kind of things. do with force, experiential physics, and the other which is to do with the logic of perception and the different perceptions that are coming with different sensory modes. And those logics may form the maps through which conceptual logics may operate.